Quebec, French-controlled Canada, 1759. All your training and experience have been building up to this moment. To stand still and be shot at by the enemy as they march towards you, waiting for the command to return fire. Before you are the French. You can see the gleaming rows of white-uniformed regulars and the French-Canadian militia in their homespun clothes. Their drums start up a steady beat as Montcalm on his steed waves his sword and the French ranks march forward. A steady chant of Vive le Roi, or Long Live the King, echoes out across the air, quickly followed by musket balls. A redcoat screams as one of the musket balls tears into his leg. Another keels over silently as life leaves his eyes. The French ranks are becoming ragged due to the untrained militia, but still they advance. Vive le Roi! Vive le Roi! This is the ultimate test of a soldier, of a man. Can you stand? Can you ignore every instinct to flee as the enemy approaches and hold the line? Blood spits into your face as the soldier next to you clutches his throat and collapses. You all shuffle up and close the gap in the lines, your eyes never leaving the French. They are so close now, you can make out every button on their uniforms. Vive la Roi! Vive la Roi! Vive la Roi! One thought races around your head. Can you stand? Can you stand? Finally, General Wolfe raises his sword, and the officers roar, "Fire!" I'm your host, James Barton. Welcome to Forgotten Wars.
This country is at war with Germany.
Today, our armed forces joined our NATO allies in airstrikes against Serbian forces.
Eagle 1, first strike, you have permission to engage the target.
In the first few hours after our servicemen went to the rescue of young Americans and of democracy in Grenada,
damals uns ausgebildet. Wollen diese 4 Jahre nützen.
Hello everyone, welcome to the show. 1759 is the year when everything changed. The year of victories for the British and the colonists. The year that the back of French power in North America was finally broken. Wolfe is about to lead an army against the fortress city of Quebec, the beating heart of New France. Awaiting him is the legendary warlord Montcalm, undefeated so far in this conflict. The two best generals Britain and France ever sent to North America are about to clash. Their epic struggle will decide the future of the whole continent. 1758 had been a mixed bag for both the British and French in North America. The capture of Louisbourg and Fort Duquesne had opened up the way to Quebec and avenged Braddock's defeat, but the disaster at Ticonderoga and its sky-high casualty rate had badly affected British morale. While the French bathed in the light of Montcalm's great victory against the odds, they were now cut off from resupply. Back in Europe, the war was going badly for France. They had seemed to be on the verge of victory. Instead, Prussia was still in the fight after Frederick the Great won a series of legendary battles. A joint Anglo-Prussian force had even defeated the French in Germany and forced them out of Hanover and back across the Rhine. As a final insult, their colonies in India and Africa were falling one by one to the hated British. Paris needed a masterstroke to turn things around, and they decided on the ever-popular, but hard-to-achieve, option of invading Britain itself. As they gathered their fleets and resources for an invasion attempt, there was nothing to spare for North America. Montcalm and his men were on their own. With Abercrombie kicked upstairs so he couldn't cause any more disasters, General Geoffrey Amherst, the conqueror of Louisbourg, was now in overall command. he decided on 3 offensives against the strongholds of French power on the continent. James Wolfe, he of the flowing red hair, would command the Quebec campaign. Brigadier General John Prideaux and Sir William Johnson were to retake Oswego and attack Fort Niagara on the Great Lakes. Amherst himself was going to attack the supposedly hardest target of all, capturing Ticonderoga and advancing on Montreal. After Abercrombie's horrific defeat at Ticonderoga and the resulting body count, both redcoats and the colonial militiamen were terrified of going anywhere near the fort again. Ticonderoga had become by now such a word of ill luck that the soldiers avoided mentioning the name at all. When they did talk about the fort, it was in hushed tones in the dead of night, each story more exaggerated than the last by its fearsome defences. Some of the troops even claimed it was bewitched by dark magic. In their minds, it had become as terrifying as Sauron's Tower of Barad-dûr in Lord of the Rings. Ironically, Ticonderoga wasn't actually that strong a fort. It was more Abercrombie's incompetence and Montcalm's brilliance that had led to the previous disaster. But the legend of Ticonderoga's impregnability refused to die. Even during the American Revolution, George Washington would call it the most fearsome fort in all the land, if not the world. To be fair to Washington, he had never actually seen it, but it shows how far the legend has spread. All this meant that when Amherst told his army of 11,000 men where they were going, they were not happy in the slightest. Damp weeks followed, with searing summer heat and torrential thunderstorms that swept down from the mountains. The men sulked under Amherst's rigid discipline, knowing that to attack the fort was certain death. There were desertions, and there would have been more if not for the French-supporting Indians lurking in the woods. One deserter's scalp and hands were found nailed to a tree. What happened to the rest of him is unknown. Finally, in late July, the expedition moved up Lake George, but with none of the bright pageantry of the year before. Instead, miserable and grumbling men set off in their boats as harsh winds whipped at their faces and clothes, while the churning of the waves brought on a round of seasickness. It wasn't the best start to a campaign, shall we say. As the army disembarked and approached the dreaded fort, Amherst observed the French lines where Abercrombie's men had been slaughtered the year before. As he eyed the grim zigzags through the morning mists, with skeletons from the previous battle still much in evidence, he noticed something surprising. The French were pulling out and making a run for the fort's gates. He spurred his men forward through gullies and thickets, with his troops often sinking waist-deep into the mire of hidden bogs. They reached the wooded lines that had caused so many deaths, and they were amazed to find them deserted. The only evidence of the French was a macabre warning they had left behind. In the centre of the lines, they had dug an open grave and set a tall wooden cross above it. This sight terrified his soldiers, but the practical Amherst was completely untroubled. He had captured the lethal defences that had decimated Abercrombie's men in less than a day, and had had a single casualty. Now he turned towards the fort itself, beginning the clockwork siege protocol of the age. Within 24 hours he was ready, and his artillery let rip, pounding Ticonderoga and setting raging fires inside the fort. The French retaliated, but their fire was inaccurate and caused few casualties. If Amherst certainly wasn't anything like Abercrombie, then the French commander wasn't a Montcalm either. Despairing of any reinforcements, and knowing he couldn't survive a siege, he slipped away with 2,500 men, leaving behind a rearguard of 400. As Amherst's clockwork siege tactics brought him almost to the granite walls, even the rearguard decided to abandon ship. 3 deserters surrendered and told Amherst that the fort was now abandoned, and that a lighted fuse had been left, leading to the powder magazine. He offered them 100 guineas, about $7,000 today, to go back and cut the fuse, but probably wisely, they refused to go. Before midnight on July the 26th, 1759, the fort exploded like a small volcano. For a moment the sky turned orange, and the crash echoed from shore to shore. Then flames crackled in the ruins. The great and terrible fortress of Ticonderoga had fallen, at a cost of only 16 men killed and 51 wounded. Even before Amherst could advance the 15 miles to Saint Frederic, the French blew up and abandoned that fort as well. The southern route to Canada and Montreal lay open, but the ever cautious Amherst stopped and refused to advance further without more preparations. The original plan had been for Amherst to capture Montreal and then link up with Wolfe at Quebec, but that wasn't going to happen now. Wolfe and his army were on their own, as Amherst dilly-dallied. Meanwhile, Johnson and Prideaux were heading towards Fort Niagara. First occupied by the French in 1725, Fort Niagara had been improved during the course of the war and was situated on a rocky point at the mouth of the Niagara River. Guarded by a 900-foot battlement that was anchored by 3 bastions, the fort was garrisoned by slightly less than 500 regulars, militia, and Native Americans, under the command of Captain Pierre Pouchot. Though he possessed a larger force early in the season, Pouchot had forwarded troops west, believing his post was safe. He was going to regret that. By July 17th, he was surrounded by the British and being pounded by artillery and mortars, desperately waiting for reinforcements. It didn't all go Britain's way, however. Prideaux was killed when one of the mortars burst and part of the exploding barrel struck him in the head. With the general's death, Johnson assumed command, though some of the regular officers didn't want to take orders from a mere colonial. As this childish dispute raged on, they were startled to hear that a French army of 1,600 men was heading straight for them, led by Captain François-Marie Le Marchand de Ligurie. 550 British and colonial troops, backed by 600 Iroquois, marched out to meet them, blockading the road. As the French attempted to storm the barricade, their flanks suddenly bristled with British and Indian rifles. Murderous fire raked their ranks as the ground filled up with the dead and dying. The French broke and fled, only to be set upon by the Iroquois. They were utterly routed, and even Ligurie was captured. He was only spared from being scalped by a timely intervention from a British officer. With no hope of rescue, Pouchot surrendered on July the 26th, deeming the French position on the Great Lakes a mortal blow. With the French reeling, all eyes turned towards Quebec in the east. From the very onset, the plan to take Quebec was filled with danger. Just getting there was going to be a challenge. Surrounded by formidable cliffs and vast forests, these natural barriers made access by land well nigh impossible. If Wolfe's army was going to get to Quebec, they would have to sail down the St. Lawrence River. This river was, and is, extremely treacherous, even today, with shifting tides, sudden shallows, and low-sitting rocks. Even the French, who had retained control of the river until the British captured Louisbourg in 1758, regularly lost ships. It was still uncharted, and so the British decision to sail a fleet down it seemed suicidal. One of the cool things about this war is that famous, or soon-to-be famous people just keep popping up in cameo roles. We've already had Washington, Benjamin Franklin, etc. Now the famous explorer James Cook enters the picture. In preparation for the fleet's approach to Quebec, Cook surveyed a large portion of the St. Lawrence River, including a dangerous channel known only as the Traverse. Cook's ship was one of the first up the river, sounding out the channel and guiding the fleet as it moved up. He was so successful that to the shock of General Montcalm, the French commander, Wolfe's force emerged before Quebec without having lost a single ship. They landed at the Ile d'Orleans, an island in the middle of the St. Lawrence River, on the 28th of June. As they viewed Quebec for the first time, it was a chilling sight. The wily Montcalm himself had prepared the fortress city's defences, and he had done an excellent job. The Quebec plateau itself was already well defended by nature, thanks to steep cliffs and a formidable fortress that had been built on top of it. But Montcalm, knew that the French couldn't stay inside and wait for the British to besiege them. His plan was to prevent Wolfe's army from landing anywhere near Quebec. He had constructed 6 miles of trenches along the St. Lawrence River. Every possible area where the British might attempt a landing was fortified and well guarded. 100 cannons were mounted on the cliff, menacingly looking over the river for targets. Montcalm was determined not to offer battle to Wolfe. Instead, his fortifications would frustrate his army, while disease and the weather would drive them off. It was a good plan, and would almost succeed. The French governor was so confident of victory that he boasted, quote, "Quebec is impregnable," end quote. Not everything was going Montcalm's way. He had drained Canada of troops to garrison his Quebec defences, raising 15,000 men. This sounds impressive, but they were mostly of poor quality. Canadian militiamen had been conscripted and dragged reluctantly off their farms. Also, while Montcalm was a senior military officer, he was technically outranked by the governor of New France, the Marquis de Vaudreuil. An arrogant, petty and smug figure, he was the first and only Canadian-born governor of New France. Surrounding himself with yes-men, he ruled the colony like a king, allowing corruption on a massive scale. His deputy, Francis Bigot, did the dirty work, taking bribes, handing out procurement contracts to cronies, and outright embezzling the millions of livres the mainland was sending to fund the war. The crooked pair lived lives of luxury, holding vast banquets while their people starved. Bigot was also a gambling addict, and it's alleged that on one occasion he was having, shall we say, relations with a woman of low repute, while gambling at the same time. I do wonder what his fellow players must have thought, but they were French, so they're probably very blasé about it. This corruption was already undermining New France from within, and will play a major role in Wolfe's victory. The historian Francis Parkman accurately sums up the Marquis de Vaudreuil as, quote, "a man in the most egregious vanity. He could not bear to share the glory of defending Canada with anyone sent from France," end quote. He despised Montcalm with a burning passion, regarding him as a jumped-up little man from the metropole. Relations between them were terrible, and they fought like cats and dogs over how to defend Quebec. A despairing Montcalm wrote home to his wife, quote, "What a country! What a man! He has turned everything upside down and made himself an object of ridicule to the regulars, the Canadians, and even the savages," end quote. Still, despite the rancour in the French camp, Wolfe's task was an immense one. He faced 3 problems: choosing the proper place to make an attack, overcoming the low morale of his army, and the early northern winter that would cause the St. Lawrence River to freeze and force the British fleet to withdraw to the open sea. In practical terms, that meant Quebec had to be taken before the first snowflakes fell. Otherwise, his outnumbered army would be marooned in the snow and ice of a faraway continent, at the tender mercy of Montcalm. Everyone knew what had happened at Fort William Henry. Wolfe had a ticking clock over his shoulder every time he made a decision. From the start, the British were harassed and attacked by scouting parties of scalp-eager Native Americans and Canadian militiamen. Sentries' throats were cut and not discovered until dawn. The bodies of deserters turned up horribly mutilated, and no soldier would dare go out on their own. Wolfe's men had to learn the same tactics that Roger's raiders were using on the frontier the hard way. They were soon camouflaging themselves by turning their scarlet coats inside out and covering their linings with mud, an early form of camouflage. The grease issued from their hair was used to dull the shine of gun barrels. They stuck leaves in their caps and learnt to make use of every bit of cover provided by the forest. By the end of the siege, those same Indians who had been killing at will were complaining that the British no longer stood still to be shot at. Nice to see some progress there. As well as Indian attacks, the French launched 7 fire ships down the river, trying to set the Royal Navy fleet ablaze or force them to retreat. Thankfully, the French set them on fire too early, and British sailors in longboats with nerves of steel managed to pull the flaming craft away from the fleet with grappling hooks. Wolfe had some luck at first. Across the river, on Quebec, was a high elbow of land called Point Levis. A small French outpost there was surprised and captured by a detachment of Rogers' Rangers. It was a highly strategic spot. From now on, the British would be able to shell Quebec at will. By the beginning of August 1759, the French estimated that 4,000 shells and 10,000 cannonballs had rained down on both the upper and lower towns of Quebec, and this was before the main battle had even been fought. Yet despite bombarding Quebec into a smoking ruin, the siege went on, and the French refused to offer battle. By the end of July, Wolfe was beginning to get desperate. Winter was coming, and his best chance of victory was to force Montcalm out of his defences and into a pitched battle. His first attempt to accomplish this occurred on July the 31st, when he landed a force of grenadiers, light infantry and rangers near Montmorency Falls, further downstream from Beauport, hoping to ford the Montmorency River and reach a position in the rear of the French lines. It was a terrible choice. At water level, the French had 2 gun emplacements. In front of this battery were mudflats, as much as half a mile wide when the tide was out. Behind it were almost vertical cliffs, with the bulk of Montcalm's army at the top. By any standards, it was a death trap. It is still a mystery how Wolfe expected to get his men up those cliffs. Despite all of this, while naval guns pounded the French positions, 3,500 troops sailed across the St. Lawrence River to fight what would be called the Battle of Beauport. It may as well have been the Massacre of Beauport. It was a disaster from the start. The river's treacherous tides prevented Wolfe from getting all of his troops in position on time, while Montcalm raced in reinforcements. Wolfe's men landed on a sultry afternoon, slogging through the mud and slime to capture the battery. It was here that a weird kind of contagious madness took over members of the Louisburg Grenadiers. They launched a completely undisciplined charge towards the cliffs and began trying to climb up. They were easy targets. Even as they clawed their way upward, clutching at branches and crevices, a thunderstorm drenched their powder and sent them slithering down the sheer rock face. All the while, the French guns mercilessly picked them off, turning the sands of the beach red with blood. Finally, Wolfe, appalled by the slaughter, ordered a retreat. 440 Brits were killed or wounded. Not a single Frenchman was killed. As the English rode away, leaving behind the twisted bodies of their comrades on the beach, the Indians crept down the cliff with their scalping knives. Back in Quebec, the French celebrated their victory, and Vaudreuil and Bigot had a vast banquet. Of course they did. Vaudreuil was in a particularly cheerful mood, writing back to Paris that, quote, "I have no more anxiety about Quebec. Wolfe, I assure you, will make no progress. He contented himself with losing about 500 of his best soldiers." End quote. After taking all the credit, he proudly boasted that the campaign was virtually over. For the remainder of the summer, Wolfe's focus changed, possibly due to frustration with Montcalm's tactics. His troops, along with American Rangers, attacked and destroyed small French settlements along the St. Lawrence. An estimated 1,400 stone houses and manors were destroyed, and many colonists killed. The effort was likely an attempt to force Montcalm's army out of its fortifications, but it was unsuccessful. However, the attacks did reduce the amount of supplies available to the French. As the British ravaged the countryside, Wolfe's guns continued to rain down death and destruction on Quebec. His incessant activity was pushing the French to the brink of starvation and causing militia desertions. Despite all of this, Montcalm remained confident of victory. He said to an aide, quote, "Wolfe's guns might very well destroy Quebec, but his redcoats will never take it. 2 more months, and they'll be gone." End quote. Wolfe was worried. He was right. Sickness was ravaging the army, and the number of men fit for duty was just half what had been on his arrival. Scurvy was so bad, they ordered his men to use the endlessly available spruce pines to brew a beer filled with vitamin C. Sadly, there are no records on what it tasted like. I imagine it was disgusting, but I'm willing to be proved wrong. Desertion shot up, and the men grumbled about their impossible mission. One officer bitterly complained that, quote, Wolfe's health is bad, and so is his generalship. End quote. Wolfe himself, never in the best of health, had become sick with severe fever and kidney stones, and believed his days were numbered. He told the army surgeon, quote, I know you cannot cure my complaint, but patch me up so I may be able to do my duty for the next few days, and I shall be content. End quote. Winter was coming. The leaves were beginning to turn, and his army was disintegrating. Whatever Wolfe was going to do, he had to do it soon. If he could just force Montcalm to give battle, he knew he could win. In a letter to his mother he wrote, quote, My antagonist has wisely shut himself up in inaccessible entrenchments, so that I can't get at him without spilling a torrent of blood. The Marquis de Montcalm is at the head of a great number of bad soldiers, and I am at the head of a small number of good ones that wish for nothing so much as to fight him. But the wary old fellow avoids any action. End quote. Finally, he had a stroke of luck. A French Catholic priest, who had fallen out with the governor, revealed a weak spot on the defences. There was a small cove west of Quebec, soon to be renamed Wolfe's Cove, with a steep path that wound up the cliffs towards the plateau. It was guarded only by about 100 poorly trained militiamen. Just past midnight on September the 13th, Wolfe and more than 4,000 soldiers under orders to maintain silence rode upriver into battle. Legend has it that night Wolfe recited to British officers his favourite poem, Thomas Gray's Elegy written in a country churchyard. Wolfe's most recent biographer, Stephen Brumwell, discounts this anecdote as unlikely, since Wolfe knew better than anyone the need to keep quiet while on the river, lest he alert French defenders. Still, the image of the doomed Wolfe reciting the lines, the boast of heraldry, the pomp of power, and all that beauty and all that wealth ever gave, awaits alike the inevitable hour. The paths of glory lead but to the grave. It may not be true, but it's too perfect an image to ever really die. There is a slight chill in the air, the first sign of the upcoming winter, as your boat edges through the water. Your oars are muffled, and everyone is silent, desperately hoping to remain unseen. But suddenly, the silence is shattered by a voice yelling, "Who goes there?" You all freeze in terror, but a young officer shouts back in perfect French, "Français, vive le roi!" You wait for angry shouts, or the boom of a musket, but all that comes out of the darkness is, "Pass, friend." That was too close. Only the young officer's quick thinking has saved your mission from discovery. Finally, you reach the cove, and Wolfe leaps into the shallows and beckons you forward. Ascending slowly up the narrow path like lethal shadows in the darkness. As you reach the top, you spot a half-asleep French sentry looking in the opposite direction. Creeping forward, you grab his mouth with one hand and thrust a knife into his throat with the other. As the rest of your comrades begin to arrive, grimly you turn to the bloody task of silencing the remaining sleeping French guards. With the pass secured, the rest of the army landed. As the darkness ebbed and dawn began to break, the horrified French saw red-coated British troops swarming up the side of the cliff. The French batteries opened up in alarm as the Royal Navy responded in kind, but it was too late. The battle Montcalm had wanted to avoid so desperately was about to begin. Wolfe formed up his force of 4,500 men on an open area of ground called the Plains of Abraham. I thought this must be a biblical reference, but apparently it was just named after a guy called Abraham who built a house there. Canadian sharpshooters who were deployed on both flanks picked off dozens of British soldiers. Among them was an English sergeant who Wolfe had reduced to the ranks for some sort of infraction. The non-commissioned officer was so angry with his commanding general that he deserted to the French before the demotion went into effect and swore personal revenge against Wolfe. On the eve of battle, he specifically requested they be allowed to join the Canadian sharpshooters, so if he was lucky, he might get a chance to shoot his old commander. The French granted his request. Montcalm had expected another attack at Beaufort and had been away from the city preparing the defences. He was stunned to find out about Wolfe's bold move and raced back to the city. At 9 a.m, he decided to attack the British because he didn't want to allow them time to entrench themselves. He told his chief of artillery that, quote, "If we give the enemy time to establish himself, we shall never be able to attack him with the sort of troops we have." End quote. Because he had so few regulars, at the outset of the campaign, Montcalm had integrated the fittest of the Canadian militiamen with his regulars, but they remained untrained in European warfare, and this is really going to show in the upcoming battle. For now, the white-coated troops marched out of the city to engage the British. Unfurling their flags at 600 yards, they confronted Wolfe's scarlet-coated infantry and grenadiers, standing perfectly still in the drizzling rain, forming two ranks in a half-mile-long line. As the minutes ticked down, Wolfe walked up and down the ranks, cheerfully talking to his men and ignoring the sharpshooters' bullets that began to buzz like angry hornets. Before long, a musket ball tore into his wrist, tearing the tendons. But he just got an aide to tie it up with a handkerchief and carried on as if nothing had happened. The rain stopped and the sun slipped out from behind the clouds. Montcalm, resplendent in his gold and green uniform, rode up and down trying to inspire his men. Yet he looked sad and despondent, as if he knew what was to come. The pale and gaunt Wolfe's face, on the other hand, shone with confidence and happiness. Finally, the French drums began to beat, and the army marched forward towards the British lines. Almost immediately, the militiamen's lack of experience and training in open combat became apparent as their formations wavered and fell out of step. Many fired their guns too soon for their shots to be accurate. Rather than the clockwork formations of Europe, it soon became a mixed mass of men firing raggedly at the British. The scarlet line remained unmoving as the bullets whizzed by, not returning fire. When a redcoat fell, the ranks closed to provide cover. Still the French pushed forward. One corporal later remembered he could even see the buttons on the Frenchmen's coats as they drew near. 60 yards, 50 yards, 40 yards. Finally, Wolfe gave the order to fire. It was a shattering volley that sounded like a roll of thunder as unit after unit fired. Stoically, as if they were drilling, the British reloaded and advanced 20 paces and fired again. It was more than the French could bear. All along their lines lay the bodies of the dead and screaming wounded. The terrified survivors broke and fled back to the town. Wolfe gave the order to charge, and the redcoats surged forward with their gleaming bayonets, while the Highlanders dropped their guns and pulled out their broadswords, determined for vengeance after Ticonderoga. "The French are fleeing! The French are fleeing!" yells out your officer in triumph. You charge after them, along with a sea of redcoats, determined to finish the job after months of disease and frustration. Raising your musket, you fire at a white-coated regular, and he nosedives into the ground. Beside you, a Canadian militiaman with a tomahawk battles a kilted Highlander with a broadsword. It is no contest, as the militiaman is almost cleaved in two by a savage strike. Some of the French are now surrendering. The others are being massacred as they try to reach the safety of the city gates. You spot Wolfe waving the army onwards, resplendent in his red uniform. But then he clutches his stomach, his face grimacing with pain. You race towards him, but a second shot pounds into his chest, and he falls to the ground. As you reach him, you think he must already be dead, as blood oozes from his mouth. But then he opens his eyes and looks up at you. With a gasp, he forces himself to speak. "Help me up. The men mustn't know I am hit." With his arms slung around your shoulders, he braves the pain as you both stumble towards Quebec. James Wolfe's bright red uniform made him an easy target as he led the charge at the front of the Louisburg Grenadiers. He was shot a second time in the stomach and then a third time in the right side of his chest. The English sergeant who deserted to the French claimed that he fired the musket ball that killed Wolfe, but we don't know if this is true. Wolfe continued issuing orders to his men until the battle was won, and then uttered his final words before he slipped away. Quote, "Now God be praised, I die contented." End quote. Montcalm, his great rival, had been forced back by his panicking soldiers when he was struck in the chest by an exploding shell near the Quebec gates. He had 2 aides hold him in the saddle so his men wouldn't see how badly he was hurt. Later on, a few moments before he drew his last breath, Montcalm asked his surgeon how much time he had to live. "A few hours," he was told. Montcalm smiled and murmured, quote, "All the better. I will not see the English in Quebec." End quote. That is the famous quote, but they were not actually his last words. The pugnacious general had one last thing to say when a messenger arrived from Vaudreuil demanding a report. Quote, "I have much business that must be attended to, of greater moment than your ruined garrison and this wretched country." End quote. For obvious reasons, this isn't quite as famous, but at least Montcalm got one last dig-in against the hated governor of New France. He was buried secretly in a shell hole in a chapel of the Ursuline convent. The hopes and dreams of New France were buried with him. The battle had lasted only 30 minutes. The British suffered 658 killed or wounded, while the French had lost 716 killed or wounded, with a further 350 taken prisoner. Governor Vaudreuil blamed the rout on the deceased Montcalm and fled the city with what was left of his army. Those that remained soon surrendered to the British. The beating heart of France's North American Empire had fallen. Wolfe became an instant hero, entering the pantheon of legendary British commanders. Right up until the 1960s, there were exam questions on him for British schoolchildren. Recently, historians have downgraded his generalship, complaining he was very lucky to have succeeded at Quebec, especially in finding the barely protected cove and path up the cliffs. Personally, I think this is overdone. Any great general was often a bit lucky. Napoleon had lucky breaks at Marengo and Austerlitz. Caesar famously rode his luck throughout his career. In the end, Wolfe did capture Quebec, at the cost of his own life. New France was now on life support, but it had one last great kick left in it. The war wasn't over just yet. Quebec was a devastated ruin, the countryside ravaged, and winter was setting in. There was no way it could support all of Wolfe's army. Eventually, 7,000 troops under the command of Colonel James Murray were left behind to garrison Quebec, while the rest sailed back to Halifax for winter. The poor garrison had a miserable winter. Scurvy, fever, and dysentery raged through their ranks. The number of able-bodied soldiers dropped to 4,000. Despite the losses, James Murray used his forces to improve the city's defences with additional fortifications, including a series of small wooden forts called blockhouses. This would turn out to be a very wise decision. For the French, the situation was difficult, but also promising. Troop morale was low following the defeat in the Battle of the Plains of Abraham, and the army was disorganized. Yet, although weakened, the French army still remained a force to be reckoned with. With the death of Montcalm, the command of France's remaining forces fell to François Gaston de Levis, a skilled and ambitious officer. In April 1760, the River Lawrence slowly cleared of ice, and both Murray in Quebec and Levis in Montreal watched anxiously to see what Europe would bring. They had no news of the war there, no idea which fleet would sail triumphantly up the river. As Fred Anderson writes, quote, by 1760, the war for North America had become a contest of endurance, where the outcome would depend on who could sustain their forces and secure the vital reinforcements needed to tip the scales. End quote. Levis was caught in a dilemma. He knew that reinforcements should be coming, and even that France was planning an invasion of Britain itself. Either event could possibly save New France, even at this late stage. But should he wait for news from France? Or attack now, and pray that one of these came true? He chose to march on Quebec with 7,000 men. General Murray was determined to defend the city. Despite being outnumbered, Murray decided to take the offensive, believing that an open battle would favour his disciplined regulars. This decision set the stage for the confrontation at Sainte-Foy, a village just west of Quebec. The Battle of Sainte-Foy was a rerun of Montcalm and Wolfe's clash, just with the two sides reversing their positions. The combat would also be far more intense and the casualties far higher. On the morning of April the 28th, Murray led his forces out of the fortified city and deployed them on high ground near to Sainte-Foy. His objective was to disrupt Levis' advance and prevent a siege of Quebec. Murray's troops were well trained and supported by artillery, but they had been weakened by months of starvation, rations, and illness. One sergeant recorded that the British army was, quote, a poor, pitiful handful of half-starved, scorbutic skeletons, end quote. Levis, aware of the importance of seizing the initiative, positioned his forces in a crescent formation, using the wooded terrain to conceal his movements. The French launched a series of attacks, taking advantage of their superior numbers and the British exposure in the open field. The fighting was fierce, with bayonet charges and musket volleys, inflicting heavy casualties. As the battle wore on, Levis' forces began to gain the upper hand. The British, outflanked and overwhelmed, were forced to retreat to the safety of Quebec's walls. By the end of the day, the French had secured a tactical victory, driving the British back and capturing several artillery pieces. On the French side, 193 soldiers were killed and 640 wounded. The British had lost 229 killed, 857 wounded, and 53 taken prisoner. Even with New France on its last legs, its forces remained formidable. However, this would be the last French victory of the war. Unlike Governor Vaudreuil, Murray refused to abandon the city. Instead, Levis was forced to besiege Quebec. The fate of North America now rested on whose reinforcements arrived first. As the French dug trenches and cannon batteries were aimed at the ramparts, morale plummeted for the British and teetered on the brink of anarchy. Fearing a wider breakdown in discipline, Murray ordered harsh punishments for offenders. One man was hanged on the spot for endemic drunkenness, and Murray had all the alcohol in the lower town poured away or destroyed. Morale improved, however, when they realized this was going to be a pretty feeble siege. Levis' cannons were not enough to break through the walls, and he only had enough powder to fire them 20 times a day. Murray's improvements to defences were also paying massive dividends, frustrating the French, while his cannons inflicted heavy casualties on their forces. During the siege, the French suffered nearly 7 times as many casualties as the British. It grew so dangerous in the French entrenchments that it was reported that the Canadians had to be paid $50 a day to work there. It became a stalemate. The French couldn't break in, but the British were not strong enough to march out and drive them off either. Victory would come to the side whose reinforcements arrived first. Little did Levis know, help wasn't coming. The French fleet had been virtually destroyed in the Battle of Quiberon Bay. The invasion of Britain was now suspended indefinitely. Paris's eyes were now fixed on victory in mainland Europe. They could spare only a tiny fleet of ships for North America, far below what Levis needed. Most of these were either captured by the British or abandoned their mission. British reinforcements arrived, and to the horror of the French, they destroyed Levis' supply ships containing precious food and ammunition. It was the end. Levis raised the siege and fled back to Montreal, leaving behind his guns and his sick and wounded. British losses during the siege came to only about 30 killed or wounded, but there were still around 1,000 sick from disease. For the French, losses were heavy, with 350 killed or wounded and another 300 taken prisoner. Montreal was soon surrounded by Amherst, finally marching up from Lake Ontario, and Murray sailing down from Quebec. Outnumbered, out of supplies, and with nothing left to steal, Governor Vaudreuil surrendered on the 8th of September, 1760. New France was no more. The 70-year struggle was at an end. The 7 Years' War would rage on until 1763, and end in defeat for France and its allies. Prussia survived with its gains intact, beginning its rise to being the dominant power in Germany. France was given a choice by Britain. They could give up North America or some of their Caribbean sugar islands. While we know how valuable North America would become, in 1763, sugar islands were far more valuable, and the French picked them instead. They held on to only 2 tiny islands, Saint-Pierre and Miquelon, south of Newfoundland, which they still control even up to today. North America was now British, yet the seeds of the next war had already been laid. Previously, the British colonies in North America had mostly been left alone by London to do as they pleased. It's called benign neglect by historians. However, this war would change that. A generation of colonists had endured the condescension of British officers such as Lord London and Braddock. Many now realised they were seen as distinctly second-class citizens by many policymakers back in Britain. You only had to look at George Washington to see how the winds were blowing. For most of this war, the one thing he really wanted was a red coat and a royal commission. Instead, he was denied this and sneered at as a mere provincial. There's a famous saying by Ronald Reagan, "I didn't leave the Democratic Party, the Democratic Party left me." I think we can say about George Washington, he didn't leave the British Empire. The British Empire left him. And he would pay for it with the loss of the 13 colonies. For so many of the Founding Fathers, it was a similar story. They felt they were being blocked by the British Empire for what they regarded as their rightful due. The British had their own grievances. They didn't forget or forgive the colonists for trading with the French throughout the war. Also, they had put themselves massively in debt to win this war, and now the state groaned under its unprecedented obligations. It seemed only right to them that the colonists should pay their fair share. The colonists, of course, didn't see it this way at all. For them, the government back in London was suddenly interfering in their affairs like a tyrant. The escalating crisis over taxes had begun. There is a reason "no taxation without representation" was the slogan of the revolution. Another issue arose from the war that would divide Britain from its colonists: Western lands. Britain had learnt bitter lessons at the hands of the Native Americans throughout this conflict, and experienced it again during Pontiac's revolt. They decided it was time to close the frontier and end Western expansion. Instead, the Ohio Valley and the Great Lakes area would be a vast reservation for the Indian tribes. It was more humane than what actually happened, but nothing could have outraged the colonists more. For the British political class, wealthy landowners to a man, land was meant to be expensive and controlled by an elite. They couldn't understand how differently the colonists viewed the issue. Cheap land was seen as a right in the colonies. It's the very origin of the American dream we know today. Everyone was speculating in land. Even Washington wanted to make another fortune in the Ohio Valley. Yet as more and more migrants arrived, land in the established colonies was becoming more expensive and pressure was building. Those new areas taken from the French looked awfully good, as colonists and speculators licked their lips in anticipation. The shock of being blocked by London was a slight they would never forget. As tensions rose to boiling point and the American Revolution began, the French were waiting in the wings. Their defeat in the French and Indian War had been a massive blow for which they wanted revenge. Soon French armies and aid would be on their way to Washington's army. They would humiliate Britain and get their revenge, but in turn, the huge debts they had run up would lead to the French Revolution. Those shots fired by Washington back in 1754 had massive consequences. They not only caused a war that destroyed France's North American empire, but in turn, they laid the seeds of the American and French revolutions. We are very much living in a world created by the French and Indian War. Thank you for listening. To help the podcast grow, please like, leave a review, or tell a friend. Next episode, we are covering the Australian Pearl Harbor. It's 1942, the Japanese juggernaut is slicing through the Allied defences like a knife through butter. Australia suddenly finds herself on the front lines of the Pacific War as the Empire of the Rising Sun plots a devastating air raid on the city of Darwin. See you next time for more Forgotten Wars.